Next, we'll turn to what's being called a silent epidemic affecting a growing number of children, trauma. In a world with more frequent natural disasters, mass shootings, and other forms of toxic stress, many kids today are being confronted with serious adversity. Our next speaker will share her expertise on treating the effects of trauma and grief in children and families. Dr. Julie Kaplow is Vice Chair for Behavioral Health and Head of Psychology at Baylor College of Medicine. She is also Director of the Trauma and Grief Center and Chief of Psychology at Texas Children's Hospital. There, she oversees treatment of traumatized and bereaved youth and families and disseminates best practices to providers nationwide. Following Hurricane Harvey, together with Children's Health Fund, Dr. Kaplow established a unique program to help children impacted by the storm and its aftermath. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Kaplow. And here to lead the interview is Jane Pauley, an award-winning journalist and the host of CBS Sunday Morning. Jane is a longtime advocate for children's health and education. She is on the board of directors for Children's Health Fund and the Mind Trust, and is a member of the leadership board at the McGovern Institute for Brain Research at MIT. Jane is also a prominent spokesperson for mental health issues. Welcome, Jane Pauley.
Well, thank you, and welcome, Julie. My role here is to really enable Julie to tell you some stories that will, I hope, provoke you to leave the room thinking about trauma in a new way, and especially thinking about grief in a way that you will take home and change the way you practice. Houston is, I think, a unique laboratory for the kind of work that Dr. Kaplow does in trauma and grief. The reference to Harvey, Hurricane Harvey, we all immediately saw visions of floods and people rescued from roofs and people slogging through water with saving puppies. And the media reporting casualty counts and so forth. Houston is routinely targeted by hurricanes. There was Rita in 2005, and even Katrina, which hit New Orleans. The refugees from Katrina, pretty much thousands of them went to Houston and stayed. So there are traumatized families who were transplanted and now in Houston. A mass shooting in Santa Fe, Texaco, which was about an hour beyond Houston, is another example of trauma. But as Dr. Kaplow will explain to you, even before Hurricane Harvey, your work had begun because, like many urban areas, the city of Houston has many, many reasons for children to be exposed to, whether it's violence or tragedy, repeat experiences with natural disasters, so forth. So it's a very new way of seeing trauma, and as I said, Houston has been your laboratory. I'm going to try to stay out of your way and just let you talk and tell stories. But to begin, define for us what you mean. I throw around trauma and traumatized, but from your perspective as a psychologist, talk to me about trauma.
Sure. So a trauma is an exceptional experience in which powerful and dangerous events overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. And we know that there can be acute traumas, single event traumas like a school shooting or a natural disaster or the death of a loved one. But there can also be chronic traumas that go on for long periods of time that we see in many of our underserved communities, like community violence. We see domestic violence and other types of traumas that occur for longer periods. And what we also know is that about half of US children will experience a trauma over the course of their lives. That equates to 35 million children nationwide. So we know this is a very significant issue. But the reason it's so important to pay attention to this issue is because we know that if we don't address childhood trauma, these kids can go on to develop lots of major problem outcomes later in life. So for example, we know that kids who experience chronic trauma grow up to have smaller brain volumes than other children. We also know that kids with trauma can go on to develop PTSD, depression, suicide risk, substance abuse, the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And we also know that some of society's biggest problems right now, including domestic violence, community violence, school shootings, even sex trafficking, are rooted in unresolved childhood trauma. So the more that we can intervene and the earlier we can intervene, the better off we'll all be as a society.
We know, you said, we know that that list of societal issues is rooted in trauma. We didn't always know that.
Right.
How do you know that?
Well, that's a good question. So a lot of the research that we're doing is really showing that these early childhood traumas result in violence later in life. And so that's something that we're actively researching within the Trauma and Grief Center, is to really understand the long-term ramifications of children who are exposed.
When I, in my capacity as a member of the board of the Children's Health Fund, our missions intersect in children. When we cover, as newspersons, we cover stories, and the flood to recede, and the mass shooting happened in the next town, we almost forget. But meanwhile, the trauma is festering. So that's why the Children's Health Fund went.
Yes.
And I went down to see what it was you were doing that was so unique. What is TAG, trauma and grief? And grief, by the way, isn't a tagline, it's not an afterthought. Just describe what you do at TAG to begin with.
So our Trauma and Grief Center is housed within Texas Children's Hospital, and we really have three main mission areas. The first is to provide services to children who've been exposed to trauma or loss. So we serve kids between the ages of 7 and 21 who've experienced any form of trauma, like those I just mentioned, or the death of a loved one. We also provide large-scale trainings in the community. So we train our community and school-based clinicians in the very same treatments that we use, because we know that we're not going to be able to serve every single child within Texas Children's Hospital, and we also want to be able to provide access to best practice care in the schools and other areas where we see the most traumatized kids. And then the third mission area is research. So we're really trying to better understand what are those important risk and protective factors that we see in children after a trauma or a loss, and how can we use that information to build better, more effective interventions. And Children's Health Fund was really instrumental. After Hurricane Harvey, we knew what we needed to do. We didn't have the funding to do it. And it was actually Children's Health Fund that launched us and launched what we call the Harvey Resiliency and Recovery Program. And really this was designed, again, to provide better access to best practice trauma-informed care. So the first thing we were able to do was we ramped up our in-house services. We were able to partner with Lyft, so we were able to bring families to and from the hospital if they didn't have transportation. We also were able to pay for parking, which we knew was a major barrier for many of our underserved families. And one of the most important things we were able to do was we deployed a couple of our trauma and grief clinicians onto our mobile unit. This mobile unit had historically been providing vaccinations and immunizations to children, but now we were able to provide evidence-based assessment and treatment to the many children who needed us the most, especially those families that were having the hardest time getting to us, or immigrant families who actually didn't feel comfortable coming to the hospital. And one example actually stands out. There was a little 10-year-old boy who we met on the mobile unit who had actually left Mexico because his father and grandmother had both been murdered, and he was witness to both of those murders. And so his mother decided that both of their lives were being threatened, they needed to flee immediately, so they made the very difficult journey over to the US. They were fortunate to move in with some family members, and then literally 2 weeks later, Hurricane Harvey hit and flooded them out of that home. So when we saw this boy on the mobile unit, he was visibly terrified and trembling and tearful. And I will never forget, he said, "We came to the US to feel safe, and now nowhere feels safe." Thankfully, we had a trauma and grief clinician on that mobile unit who was able to serve that child, work with that child for a period of really 6 months, and his PTSD symptoms subsided. He was able to process his grief and loss issues that he was having, and even the physicians on the mobile unit talked about how this looked like a different child after therapy. And I'm really convinced that if we did not have the mobile unit, this child would have never received those very specialized trauma-informed services that he needed.
You use the phrase evidence-based a couple of times. In the news, you'll often hear people report, and grief counselors are on the scene of whatever. Right. Your grief counseling isn't a sympathetic arm and a pat on the back.
Right.
Evidence-based means that you're doing something different and you know it works, and you're not doing something that you know doesn't work.
Exactly, exactly. And that's so important because there are, a number of very well-meaning trauma organizations out there that are out to help the children, but when we're not using research to guide what we're doing, when we're not looking at measurement-based care where we're actually assessing children when they come in the door and looking at how their symptoms are changing over time, we're not using best practices. So
and your assessments mean you actually can target improved care. Let's talk about grief. Many hospitals have offer trauma treatment. Leaving this room, what you want to add to that is the importance of recognizing bereavement as a traumatic experience under many circumstances.
Yes.
Just talk to me about grief.
Sure. So this is a really important distinction. When we talk about the distinction between trauma and bereavement or PTSD and grief, and sometimes the way I like to describe it is if you can imagine the last time that you felt petrified, like you weren't sure if you needed to run or freeze in place, and what that experience was like in your body and what you were thinking at the time, that is often the experience of children who have PTSD as a result of a traumatic event. But now imagine the last time that you felt so sad that you didn't think you'd be able to stop crying, and how that felt in your body and what you were thinking at the time. And that's often what children experience when they're grieving in response to bereavement. And so the reason this is so important is because, sadly, many of our children are dealing with both of these things at the same time, but they actually require different assessments and different treatments to be able to treat them effectively. And that's why we're really focused on both. In addition, bereavement is a unique type of trauma in that, first of all, it's the most common form of trauma nationwide. It's also the most distressing form of trauma for both children and adults. So if you were to ask anybody what was the hardest thing that ever happened to you, the vast majority would say it was the death of so-and-so. And in addition, we know that it's also the strongest predictor of poor school outcomes above and beyond any other form of trauma. So we actually looked at 14,000 students across the country and found that the sudden death of a loved one predicted worse school outcomes above and beyond sexual abuse, physical abuse, domestic violence, experiencing an accident. So we know that it's critically important.
Number one. Now, maybe the reason that the idea of treating bereavement is novel is because it is ubiquitous.
Right.
Everyone experiences loss and grief. When does bereavement become something that rises to the level of, the doctor needs to see this child?
Right, right. That's a great question and so important to be thinking about. So one of the things that we're very careful about is not pathologizing normal grief or healthy grief. And there is that distinction between a maladaptive grief reaction and an adaptive grief reaction that we need evidence-based assessment tools to help us distinguish that. But just to give you some examples, when we're talking about grief in children, we're really talking about it in a multidimensional way. So it's not as if they either have maladaptive grief or they don't. They may be high or low on different dimensions. So for example, they may be high or low on separation distress, which is yearning or longing for the person who died, so really missing the person. Or they may be high or low on existential or identity distress, so how am I going to get through life without this person here? Or they may be high or low on circumstance-related distress, which is exactly what it sounds like, being very preoccupied with how the person died. So I wish I could have intervened, or I wish they didn't have to suffer so much. But the important thing to note is that there is such thing as good grief. So even within all of those dimensions, we see adaptive or healthy ways of dealing with that grief.
Give me an example of good grief.
Sure. So in the domain of separation distress, for example, I was treating a 9-year-old girl whose mother died of cancer. She was her best friend, and this child was devastated, of course, and missed her mom intensely. And as part of the treatment, she was encouraged to do things that made her feel closer to her mother. So she started to engage in behaviors that she used to do with mom. So she started making her mom's favorite apple pie. She started to take swim lessons because that was something that she loved to do with her mom. And the more she engaged in those behaviors, the closer she felt, almost like this was a new type of relationship with her mom, obviously one where her mom was not present, but a way of feeling connected. So that would be a healthy way of dealing with separation distress. With existential distress, we hear all the time kids saying, I don't know how I'm going to get through life without my dad here. But we also hear them saying things like, I want to live the kind of life my dad would have wanted me to live, or I want to do things that would have made my dad proud of me. And then with circumstance-related distress, we see this all the time where kids will naturally gravitate toward trying to change the circumstances into something that can help other people. So I was treating a 10-year-old boy whose father died in a tragic plane crash. And when I asked him, what do you want to be when you grow up? He said, I want to be an engineer so I can make planes that don't break anymore. So we see this again all the time where kids will raise money for breast cancer if mom died of breast cancer, or we'll see kids rallying against gun violence after a school shooting. And some of society's biggest solutions to problems actually come from children or adults rallying to address those circumstances and to change them into something that can help other people.
This possibly a little redundant, but you said that you're not trying to pathologize grief. Among the psychological disorders, PTSD, OCD, depression, that this grief is a category that is unique among that list.
Right.
And it's positive, that it's possible to have positive grief. Can you turn maladaptive grief, channel it toward the positive grief?
Exactly, and in fact, that is what we try to do in the evidence-based treatments that we're using, is that we're not only trying to simultaneously reduce the maladaptive grief, but we're really harnessing that adaptive grief that is often there naturally. We just have to kind of capture it and elevate it.
Julie, we didn't talk about this at all, but the number of times you've used evidence-based, I think, is one of the distinctions that is unique to Texas Children's and your Trauma and Grief Center. You don't just do what seems logical. It is evidence-based. So what do you do that is evidence-based, if possibly counterintuitive, when you're treating a child?
Yeah, so one of the things that we do, oftentimes we will get phone calls from very concerned parents. My husband died 3 weeks ago. I'm very worried about my children. Can you see them immediately? And we will evaluate those kids, but oftentimes we will say to parents, you know what? We evaluated your child, we used this evidence-based assessment, and it's telling us that they're actually grieving normally, and you don't need our services. Now, that doesn't mean that they don't need support from family or friends, but we don't want to pathologize grief that is actually working in the way that it's supposed to.
So what do you hope people leave with?
So that's a good question. What I really hope is that people do understand this distinction, that this difference between trauma and grief is a difference that makes a difference, that we need evidence-based interventions and assessments that directly address each of those, and that recognizing the importance of intervening early with kids who've been traumatized or bereaved can hopefully get them back onto a normal developmental trajectory and ensure that we as a society are not facing some of the significant problems that we are today.
Julie Kaplow, you are a game changer and a leader, and I congratulate you. And thank you for your attention.